Looking for your next gripping page-turner? Head over to Dead Good, the home of killer crime books, TV and film, for recommendations, discounted books at bargain prices and exclusive giveaways. Visit deadgoodbooks.co.uk, sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. See you in Harrogate for the Dead Good Reader Awards in 2021. We can't wait.
You are joining with audiences from across the globe to enjoy Harrogate's International Festival's series of online events, streamed straight from our home to yours. Sit back, relax and enjoy New Blood with Val McDermid as part of the Theakston Old Peculiar Crime Writing Festival, sponsored by Dead Good. We promise you've got the best seats in the house.
Welcome to the 2020 Theakston's Old Peculiar Crime Writing Festival New Blood panel. I'm Val McDermid and it's my fortunate task to present to you 4 new authors whose books will, I think, excite you and engage you in equal measure. As always, I think I've got the best job in crime fiction because I get the first dibs on the debut novels every year. I get to wade my way through lots and lots of fascinating debut novels. And I have to tell you, this is a job that gets harder and harder with every passing year. The quality just keeps going up and up. But 4 writers today who I think are absolutely terrific reads. I'm going to introduce them to you one by one, but I'm quickly going to go through their names and their books. This is 7 Lies by Elizabeth Kay. By the way, I apologise that these are just proof copies, but that's because I have to read early and read often. This is 7 Lies is a book about friendship and about betrayal and about the way that things gradually peel away as truth emerges from lies. Next up is Trevor Wood, The Man on the Street. Now, Trevor's novel is set in an unusual world. It's the world of the homeless. His protagonist is a homeless man in Newcastle, and I think this is an extraordinary book because it takes us into a section of our society that we very seldom get to see from the inside. I think it's a damn good read. Next up, Deepa Anappara, Gin Patrol on the Purple Line. And that's gin with a DJ, not a G, as most of you are used to. This is an extraordinary novel. The narrator is a 9-year-old boy in a slum of an unnamed city in India. It starts off with great humour. This is a smart, precocious kid who watches cop shows and thinks he can live the world according to what he's learned from cop shows, but gradually it turns darker and darker, and this gives us again an insight into a world we don't often get to see. And the 4th book on our panel today is by Jessica Moore, and it's called The Keeper. This starts off with the death of a young woman, and then we explore what led to her death and who brought it about. It deals with domestic violence. It deals with issues around who gets listened to when problems arise. And I think it's a terrific read again that shines a light onto areas in our current social lives that we don't always deal with very comfortably. So I'm going to give them all a chance to tell you a bit more about their books in just a moment. So the first question for our authors today is, what can you say to this avid audience who are desperate for fresh blood because they've read all my books, they've read all Mark Billingham's books, they've read all Denise Miner's books, they need something to get their teeth into. What would you say to these people eager to love you that will make them rush out and read your book? So Elizabeth Kay, what can you tell us about 7 Lies that is going to tempt us?
7 Lies is about the 7 lies that one woman, Jane, tells to her best friend, Marnie. And these lies start really innocuously. Jane has just been to dinner with Marnie and with Marnie's boyfriend, Charles. And Marnie asks what Jane thinks of this boyfriend. And Jane, lying through her teeth, says that she likes him and that she thinks they're really good together. The lies escalate from this point. They become darker and they become more sinister until they eventually result in a death. It is a book for me that is really about female friendship and about how our friendships can evolve from childhood and into adulthood. It is also about loss and about grief. And I sort of wanted to explore the things that we might find ourselves doing in our very darkest moments. I also really wanted to write a reliable narrator. That was something I set out to achieve But it proved more difficult than I'd expected, because while Jane will never tell you anything that she knows to be false, I realised, partly in the writing and partly in conversations since, that this isn't necessarily the same as the truth.
And have you had any reaction to the book so far?
One woman said, I have to admit to being really chuffed by this, because I think it's something that maybe all writers aspire to, that her bath water went cold as she was flicking through the pages. So that was really lovely. I hope it ticks some of the boxes for things that I look for in a book, something dark and unsettling and really quite unnerving. I don't know if the narrator is likeable or unlikable. People seem quite split on this. I am very fond of Jane, who narrates the entire book, but I guess you'll have to decide that one for yourselves.
Thanks, Lizzie. I'm sure people are going to be very tempted by that account. Now, Trevor, it's over to you. Trevor Wood, The Man on the Street. What will people love about your book, Trevor?
The Man on the Street is about a homeless veteran suffering from PTSD called Jimmy, who, whilst sleeping rough one evening, sees two men arguing and thinks that one of them ends up in the river. He kind of keeps quiet about it for a while because he's had a lot of trouble in the past. But then he sees an appeal from a young woman looking for a missing father and thinks that he recognises him as one of the men he saw arguing. So he contacts her and they start to search for her dad. The current story is linked by a series of small flashbacks, if you like, that show us how Jimmy ended up on the street, because I think the homeless are largely demonised, and I really wanted to humanise them. So I wanted to show that you can end up on the streets through a whole series of events: bad luck, job loss, marriage breakups, addictions, and hopefully by showing how this ex-serviceman ended up on the streets, it will help people to understand them better. Plus, he has a dog called Dog, and I think he's probably the finest pet in crime fiction at the moment. And I'm very happy to give you a plot spoiler that Dog does not die, so you can relax when you start to read it.
That's a very good point. Very early in my career, I had a book where a dog died horribly, and my agent said, "Darling, you can't do that. We'll never sell it in America." So ever since then, I've realised you can do all the horrible things you like to small children, and you can torture people, but don't hurt the animals. So next up, we've got Deepa Anappara, who's going to talk to us about Gin Patrol on the Purple Line. Tell us all about your book.
The idea for Gin Patrol on the Purple Line came from the real-life disappearances of children in India, where I lived for most of my life. As many as 180 children are thought to go missing each day across the country. And I wanted to write a story about these disappearances, but from the point of view of children, because that's a perspective that's missing.
And it works really well to have such an unusual narrator. We don't usually have children telling us these kind of stories. And I think one of the great things about this book is that it does bring a tremendous humour and lightness to the storytelling. And of course, as the story gets darker and darker, the contrast's all the more vivid.
The novel is about a 9-year-old boy named Jay. He watches a lot of cop shows on TV and fancies himself to be something of a detective. So when children start disappearing from his neighborhood, he decides to look for them using these techniques that he has seen on TV. And in that, he enlists the help of his friends, Pari, who is the brains of the outfit, and Faiz, who is streetwise and has a knack for finding the right clues. So the children set out on what they think is an adventure, but events soon take a sinister turn. So it's a novel about the disappearances of children and its impact on an impoverished community that's neglected by the outside world. At the same time, we see the events unfold through the eyes of children, and so their humor, their innocence are also present in the pages of the book. As to why people should read it, I hope they do so for the same reasons that I wanted to write it, which is essentially because of the children, their characters, their relationships, their families, and the sort of resilience that they display and the ability to find hope in the most difficult of circumstances.
Thanks so much, Deepa. Now over to Jessica Moore, who's going to tell us about Keeper and why it's going to fascinate you and keep you reading into the small hours. Jess, take it away.
So Keeper is set in a world that most of us aren't familiar with, even though it's right around us, and it's set in the world of a women's refuge, which I did some work in, and I felt that these places were almost like this underground railroad, these places that only exist because the state's not working, because dangerous people are trying to kill women and no one's stopping them. And for me, that's a really interesting space because it's a danger zone, but it's also a place where people have got to get together and live together, even though they might be from very different circumstances. And it's a book about coercive control, which is a law that is pretty new and that few of us really understand. It's a concept that isn't about a single thing that a person does, which is our usual conception of a crime. It's about a pattern of behaviour. And for me, a pattern of behaviour is just another word for a story. So if you want to understand coercive control, which I do, I'm fascinated by it psychologically, then you've got to understand a story. So I tell the story of a young woman called Katie, who is bright and educated and has a lot of the things in the world going for her. But something happens and Katie dies, and I wanted to follow the story of why that happens.
I think this is a very useful novel at this particular time because although coercive control has been something that's been talked about in the headlines, I think a lot of us don't really understand how that works its way through in such an insidious way. And all four of these novels, in their different ways, tell us about the world, elements of the world that we may not necessarily experience ourselves, but we need to know about if we're going to have a full understanding of the world that we're living in. And the great thing about crime novels is it lets us tell these stories that are about complicated issues, but never lose sight of the fact that what we're doing is engaging with the reader in a story. All of these books have that in common. You're drawn in by the characters, drawn in by the story, and in the course of that, you learn about the world. For anyone who has ambitions to be a writer, there's a huge scope in what you might choose to write about, how you might choose to write about it. So what I want to ask all of you is, what drew you to crime fiction?
The short answer is Gone Girl. I didn't think of myself as a crime reader at all, and yet everyone was raving about this book, and so I picked up a copy at an airport, and I don't think I stopped until I'd finished. I was so wowed by it. Because I didn't know the genre, I wasn't looking for the twists or expecting all those turns, and I was completely floored by the part that I won't mention it just in case anyone hasn't read it, although I'm pretty sure most of you will have. But I knew there and then that I wanted to read more books like that and experience that same shock and awe again and again. And I think it's an exciting genre because that hasn't been hard to find. There have been so many really brilliant crime novels in the last few years that I've never been short of a really unpredictable, twisty read. And I think that was where my love of the genre really began. And then in terms of writing in this space, I suppose it's a similar answer. I read all of these brilliant books and I was so excited by them, and I think I really wanted to achieve something similar with Seven Lies, a book that felt unpredictable, a book that made you think about things differently, a book with characters that made you ask questions. And I think for me, more often than not, it's a crime novel that keeps me up reading late, or that I want to cancel plans to read. That's the book that when someone says, oh, you need to be here now, I say, no, not today. I'm reading.
I think I definitely have to blame Enid Blyton, the gateway drug to crime fiction. I think Enid is, and I think I got to crime fiction via her and Agatha Christie, with a little bit of Scooby-Doo probably in the middle. I always kind of sided with those pesky kids. I think things have moved on a lot since then, though. It's such a broad church now, crime fiction. There are cozies and spy novels and psychological thrillers, police procedurals, So within the structure of a crime novel, you can write about almost anything and really address social issues. So you can combine pace and storytelling with social commentary, which you can't really do in most other forms, I think. And it's quite noticeable that on the panel this year, there are so many issues being addressed. Domestic violence, Jessica is addressing that. Deepa is looking at child trafficking. I'm dealing with homelessness. And I think that's the joy of writing in crime fiction, that you can tell an interesting story whilst hopefully informing people on what's happening out in the real world.
Agent Patrol on the Purple Line was a lot to crime fiction, primarily because the main narrator, Jay, is a huge fan of true crime shows. And, his tropes and techniques come from these shows, and it comes from crime fiction. Like many people of my generation, as a child, I was reading sort of children's detective novels like Famous Five, Hardy Boys, and Nancy Drew, but also sort of Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie and Indian detective novels.
I remember that when I was at the Kolkata Literature Festival a couple of years back, and I read some of the Bengali crime novels ahead of going to the festival, because I always like to be a bit, well read in the local stuff, so that I can say something useful in the conversation. And I was struck then by how similar they were to the Sherlock Holmes tradition, rather than perhaps the Philip Marlowe tradition or the Agatha Christie tradition.
That was my idea, that Jay would start out sort of imagining he was Sherlock, but he would soon discover that he's actually not as smart as his friend Perry. So definitely I drew on those tropes for this novel, but I think with my main aim, as it is in a lot of crime fiction, was to sort of use the crime to combine narrative urgency with social commentary. So I wanted to write about a particular crime, which is the disappearances of children, but use that as a lens to look at all the various unsavory aspects of society, in this case Indian society, which allows these crimes to to be committed in the first place and to flourish.
I liked the way that in crime fiction there's this understanding that what you're doing in the collaboration between the writer and the reader is that together you're solving a puzzle, and there's a sort of promise hidden in that if you solve the puzzle, then the order of the world will be restored, and that's a promise that you can either fulfill or not fulfill. And I thought that there was something really interesting that it was possible for me to do in subverting that promise. And the other reason that I wanted to work in crime fiction is because I'm writing about domestic violence, and domestic violence is a crime, which seems like an obvious thing to say, but it's often not treated as a crime. It's often treated as just a domestic, something that's interpersonal, that's private, that isn't worthy of the same scrutiny that we might apply to something like a murder. So by looking at domestic violence through the lens of a crime novel, I felt that was restoring domestic violence to its rightful place as something that we should be thinking about ethically and as an infringement that needs to be addressed.
It's great to hear such different routes into crime fiction, because of course that means you're all bringing a different feel to what you're writing about. And I think we've all got our gateway drugs into this genre, and once we get hooked, we stay hooked. That's one of the great joys, I think, about this community of readership, is that people read widely and read extensively, and I know that you're going to enjoy these four to add to your book pile. Now, we live with a book for a long time before it ends up between covers and out there in the world, and every book has some sort of meaning for the writer beyond just getting a book out there. What does it mean to you to write this book and have it published?
The heart of Seven Lies for me is very much in female friendship. I felt that I'd read lots of really exceptional books that looked at the tensions that can exist in romantic relationships and particularly in marriages, but I didn't feel that I'd read quite as many that looked at friendships. And so I wanted to explore both the wonderful things about female friendship, how they can be really close and really intimate, and how you can feel like you found a real ally and how you have such huge support, as well as the potentially less positive things, whether that be jealousy or a really overwhelming intensity or moving apart physically and or emotionally. And so that is what I set out to do with Jane and Marnie in Seven Lies. They were incredibly close as children. They first met when they were 11, but now in adulthood the cracks are really starting to show. For me, there is something really special about a friend who's known you your entire life, or at least for a really considerable chunk of it. I've known my best friend since I was a child, since before I can remember, to be honest. So we have evolved together and our lives have changed together as we've grown older. And we've been really fortunate in that we're still really close. But at the same time, I can see that there have been points along the way where cracks could have appeared and where tensions might have started to exist. And for Jane and for Marnie, this is just starting to happen. And it is starting with a new boyfriend.
Well, it's a big question. This book means everything to me. Three things in particular, I guess. I volunteer at the People's Kitchen in Newcastle, where I live. And if this book makes even a handful of people think a little bit more, take a different view of the situation that the homeless find themselves in, and donate more money, clothes, etc., to my organisation or any other organisation that supports the homeless, then my work is done. Secondly, I like to think it's a love letter to my adopted city. As you can tell, probably from listening to me, I'm not a Geordie, and if I dare even try and speak it, my wife and daughter will kill me, I think. But I didn't move here till my 30s, and it really felt like coming home. I was embraced by the city, and I embraced it. I wanted to capture in the book the vibrancy, the energy, the camaraderie that I've felt since I moved to Newcastle. So I hope that I've done that. And finally, I think as you can see, as everybody can see, I'm no spring chicken. So I kind of hope that I'm flying the flag for the late starters, just sending out a message to those people who've been sitting around with that book in their head for years and haven't got around to writing it, and maybe think that it's too late, that it's never too late. Give it a go, see how it goes. If I can do it, really, anybody can do it.
Gin Patrol on the Pipeline is obviously it's a very personal book for me. It came from my experiences as a journalist in India, where I worked for over 11 years, and in that time I often interviewed children in impoverished neighborhoods about education, about why they're working and not in school. And this is how I came to learn about the disappearances of children and how frequent they were, and how the police and the government didn't try to find them because these children were from poor families. So it's a book that came from those experiences of what I learned as a journalist. One of the other things is that the children I interviewed, they were often funny. They could be quite sarcastic, and these were sort of traits that I couldn't capture in my news reports. And I felt that in fiction, I had a better opportunity to realize them really fully. So that was really why this book was important to me. But also, I wanted to write about the disappearances of children because it's not a subject that's discussed very much. Often we don't know who these children are, what their hopes, dreams, and ambitions were. And with this book, I wanted to bring them to life and to, sort of indicate very clearly what we are losing when we don't pay attention to, our vulnerable communities. So for me, it's quite political, as my reporting was.
I was working in the domestic violence sector, and in order to try and campaign and change things, you've often got to use language as this sort of blunt instrument where you're reeling off these statistics. 2 women a week are killed by a partner or former partner. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence over the course of their lifetime. And what that means in reality is that you or someone you know will experience this. But in that industrial strength language of campaigning, it's hard to get the humanity of that realization across. I wanted to go deep into that idea that me or somebody I know could go through this. So it was a movement from understanding something rationally, that this takes place, to trying to understand it emotionally, because I think that's what fiction does. And hopefully it will do that for the reader too.
I think that something we can all gather from all 4 of these books and the stories you tell about what generated them is something I've known for a long time, and that is that fiction allows us to tell stories that we can't necessarily cover in reportage in the same way. Sometimes there are things we just can't say because of the laws of libel, or because the people involved in them are still alive and we don't want to hurt or upset them. But sometimes it's just that the story told as a journalistic story doesn't have the impact of telling it in a novel. And all 4 of these books, in their different ways, communicate that very clearly. We get under the skin and we tell stories that don't get heard normally. One of the things that people often ask me still, after all the books I've written and all the events I've done over the years, is about my process and about the circumstances in which I write. They want to know about the room that I write in, they want to know how I write. And so I want to ask you that question. Tell us a bit about the circumstances in which you wrote this book and about your process.
I was working full-time while writing 7 Lies. In fact, I'd spent the previous 3 years working on a different novel, and I had done a huge amount of work editing it. I had added characters only to take them away. I had spent hours and hours restructuring the whole plot numerous times because I wanted to create something that I felt really proud of. And I think because I had been told that in order to be successful as a writer, you have to really persevere. And I interpreted that as just keep going and do not give up, which with hindsight was not the right way for me to work at all because the book was absolutely terrible. But it meant that when I started 7 Lies, it felt fresh to me and it felt exciting and it felt like a joy to do after several years of really tedious writing work. So I would get up very early on Saturdays and Sundays. I would write on the sofa with my laptop in my pyjamas, and I was really enjoying it. It felt good fun. I stole hours from the evening, sometimes early mornings in the week when I could. But my favourite place was there on the sofa until partway through writing the book, a car crashed through the front wall of my house into the exact spot where I would normally sit.
What?
And thankfully no one was hurt, but my routine went out the window. I was then working from hotel rooms and from my parents' house. We were all over the place while the repairs happened. And I think that was probably an important lesson for me, not to be too precious about the when and the how and the where, but just to make sure to sit and find the time to write as much as possible.
When I first thought about writing a crime novel, I tried to write a comic novel. I've been co-writing comic plays for about the last 12 years with a degree of success. So it seemed the obvious way to go, but I didn't realise that they're very hard to place in the industry. Publishers are a bit frightened of comic crime. Apart from Mick Herron, I think. I'm hoping he's going to lead a comeback. And so the book didn't get picked up. And at the same time that kind of happened, I saw that UEA had started the very first specialist crime writing MA, and the timing was perfect for me. And the whole aim of the MA was to write an 80,000 word crime novel. It wasn't to produce academic essays. So I applied and got a place, and it was a joy from start to finish. Our first visiting writer on our very first residential. It was a part-time course, so we were only there 3 weekends a year. The rest was done online. But on the very first weekend, we walked into the classroom and Lee Child was our visiting writer. We had 3 hours in a classroom with Lee, just asking him anything we wanted to, which was amazing, and started everything off on the right foot. And after that, we had Mark Billingham, Ian Rankin, Denise Minor, all came to talk to us. and to give us the chance to pick their brains, if you like. And I kind of decided to take advantage of all this brilliant advice and support from the tutors and my fellow course members to completely change my style. I read a lot of dark stuff like David Peace and James Elroy, things much darker than my normal reading, really, just to try and absorb some of that, because I knew that I wanted to write this book about a very damaged homeless guy. And I needed to kind of change the lifestyle that I normally write. I don't plan much at all, really, with the books for the process. I really try to focus on the character. All the books that I love, I don't remember the plots at all. I couldn't tell you any of them, but I remember Harry Bosch, I remember Dave Robichaud, I remember Rebus. So when I'm writing, I tend to focus a lot more on creating memorable characters rather than the plot. I always kind of think I can retrofit the plot. I mean, that, maybe that's not right. When you read this, you'll think, oh yeah, great characters, where's the plot? But I hope not. I think I've managed to combine both. But for me, the process is mostly about the characters.
I think you're selling yourself a bit short there, Trevor. Even in the darkest moments, you find the humour in those dark places. It's not just a one-note samba of misery and pain. I found plenty of places that brought a smile to my lips.
My initial idea, because I had this when I was working as a journalist in India, was to write it as non-fiction, but my sort of personal circumstances changed. I ended up moving to the UK, but I had the story in my head, and I sort of wondered if I could explore the subject as fiction. But very quickly I realized that I didn't know anything about how to write fiction, because I trained as a journalist and I worked as one. And as a journalist, you're taught to be sort of impartial in how you write a story, and I was really wedded to facts. I didn't trust my imagination. So for all those reasons, it was really difficult for me to attempt writing fiction. So I joined an evening course, a short evening course in writing, and as part of which I tried to write, the story about children's disappearances. But I think I just didn't have the skill to write it at that point, because and I also had all sorts of ethical questions about whether I had the authority to write a story like this, because it's very much about the real pain that many parents in India experience even to this day. I mean, my fear was that it would, you wouldn't be able to see anything more than their problems if you read a book about children's disappearances, because of the darkness of the subject. So I sort of put it aside. I wrote other stories, I wrote other novels, none of which went anywhere. And I returned to the subject of missing children when I was doing an MA in creative writing at the University of East Anglia. At that time, I had access to Jay's voice, and he was really my way into the story. And I built everything else around his voice. So I'm not much of a planner, and it's essentially by writing the story that I discover who the characters are and what their interests are. So I started with that, with sort of figuring out what is happening by writing these characters in the initial stages. And obviously it was in the in the revision stages that I sort of looked at narrative progression and pace and all that.
I wrote this book while studying for an MA in creative writing at the University of Manchester. I was living in a little basement flat with frogs and slugs coming up through the toilet, and it was in the middle of winter and the boiler was broken, so I was very cold and quite grumpy. And I wrote the first draft in 2 months, and then I edited it for about 2 years. Because I'd been working in the domestic violence sector, and there was this kind of howl of anger that I needed to get out, and I feel like that was conveyed to the reader. But then you've got to make it a good story as well, and you've got to make it twisty and turny and exciting, and that is tough. That's why people like Val are so amazing, because they can do that again and again. But for me, that came in the form of a lot of editing and a lot of pacing and trying to make this thing that I felt very deeply and I really cared about come through in a narrative that you would want to read.
So we've all been in that place. We've written the manuscript, we've done all we can with it, we're not sure if it's any good at all, and I have to tell you, even after 33 novels, that's still the way I feel. Get to the end of it, think, is this actually a book or is it just a pile of words? But you've got that pile of words. How do you get from that big thick bundle of manuscript to the finished book? What was your road to publication like?
Because I work as an editor myself, I was really wary of sending the manuscript out to agents because I was worried that people would think that it wasn't very good. And so I sent it out under a pseudonym to just a few agents who I either worked with or knew of and who I thought were really impressive. And I was incredibly lucky. I heard back from Maddie, my agent, very quickly, and then sent her the full manuscript. And late on a Sunday evening, probably after 11, I think, I received an email from her saying how much she loved it. And I was in bed. I read it out to my husband a few times. Then I had to call my mum, who was also in bed. She thought something was horribly wrong, but no, I read it to her a few times. And I think I must have read it to myself about a dozen more times before eventually going to sleep. And I don't know that I've ever been so giddy about anything before. It was such an exciting moment, and none of the things that have happened since then would have without that email. From that point on, I got to work with two really brilliant editors who made me think about the book in a different way and who really challenged me to make it better. And it felt like a real privilege to have two really brilliant editors taking the time, putting in their effort, thinking about it in a really detailed way. So that was hugely exciting. In fact, the whole process has been incredibly exciting. I would say it published 2 weeks into lockdown. So that was slightly unexpected, not what I would have thought of when envisaging that part of this journey. But actually, I've managed to speak to a huge number of readers online, and that's been probably more than I would have been able to in person. So that has been a really wonderful experience. I still loved it. It wasn't what I'd expected or what any of us would have expected for 2020, but it's been the most incredible whirlwind.
The road to publication is, somebody described it to me like the foxtrot. It's like slow, slow, quick, quick, slow. It took me a while to get an agent after I started to send this book out. But then when I got interested, all happened very quickly. Ollie Munson, my wonderful agent at AM Heath, started reading it on the day I sent it to him. He sent me a message that same evening saying he was reading it on the train and really enjoying it. And he contacted me the next day. And later the next day, he contacted me to say, let's have a conversation tomorrow. And I signed with him within another day. It was incredibly quick. But then it went out on submission and was out for ages. Lots of kind of nice comments, lots of positivity. But nobody was quite sure how to place a book about a homeless man. I had one massive interest from an editor who really liked it and wanted to take it, but he couldn't get it through the acquisitions meeting with the rest of his team. We had a great meeting in London where he suggested that if I did some rewrites, he could probably get it through the second time. So he gave me some notes. The whole thing took maybe 3 or 4 months. I rewrote the thing fairly substantially, and it went back to him, and he still couldn't get it through the acquisitions meeting. So I was back to square one, really. But very fortunately for me, Ollie decided to go out again and went out with the new version. So it was well worth doing all the work in the end. And I had 3 offers, I think, within a week of it going out. And very fortunately, one of them was from Jane Wood at Quercus, who is now my editor and is fantastic to work with. Then, of course, you have to wait a long time. I signed this deal almost 2 years ago. So you wait a long time, everything happens quite quickly. You wait a long time, everything happens quite quickly, and then you wait a long time again. But now the book's out, so great. It was well worth the wait.
My road to publication is pretty long and convoluted, partly because I had no idea how to write a novel when I started, and I had to teach myself how to write it. So, I tried writing Gin Patrol about, I would say, soon after I moved to this country, which was more than a decade ago. Then I set it aside. I wrote another novel. I submitted that novel to a couple of agents, and they both rejected it pretty promptly. So I knew it wasn't good enough, and I needed to learn more about how to write fiction. So I wrote another novel. I didn't show it to anybody. Then I wrote several short stories. I was sort of still figuring out how to write, and I think this is partly because I had never studied literature, never studied creative writing, and I felt that perhaps some formal grounding would help. So I did an MA, and it was during the MA that I started writing Gin Patrol on the Purple Line. At that time, I submitted to various contests for novels in progress, and part of the reason I did that was because I felt that if the novel was as much as longlisted, it would indicate to me that I should keep writing, given all my previous failures, and B, it would be something to mention in a query letter to an agent, and it might just make my book sort of be picked from the slush pile. So I also used the deadlines to motivate myself to complete a certain number of words. So I submitted to these prizes, and very fortunately for me, it won these awards, and I met the literary agency that represents me. I met them through these awards, and I essentially left the entire publication side of things to them. Partly because I didn't know anything about it. I hadn't allowed myself to think that far, given that I hadn't, my previous work hadn't pretty much gone anywhere. So I wanted to save myself disappointment by not thinking too much about publication, and I had no idea how it worked, which is why it's good to have literary agents, because it's a job, and they can help you and look after your interests. So they submitted my novel to publishers.
So after I finished my MA in creative writing, I had some interest from agents, but nothing certain. And I moved to Amsterdam and became a Deliveroo rider, and was pedaling around the city of Amsterdam and emailing agents and working on this book over and over and sending it to people, getting feedback, sending it out again. And then to make money, I was working as a ghostwriter. I wrote some really terrible stuff. I wrote a novel a month. So I was cobbling together a living as a writer, and all my hopes were pinned on trying to make this novel work. And then about a year after I finished, almost exactly to the day, a year after I finished my master's degree, I got a call saying that Penguin wanted to preempt the book, and then everything changed. And I worked on the novel for about 6 months with my editor at Penguin, and now it is as you see it.
So congratulations to the four of you. You made it down the long and bumpy road to publication. And for those of you out there who are aspiring writers who hope that one day maybe you'll be sitting here on the stage for the New Blood panel, I would just say to you, stick with it. Don't give up. Don't stop after that first chapter because it's not perfect, because it'll never be perfect. Just keep bashing on to the end and push and push and push, and don't give up. And one day this dream could be your reality too. It's been like that for all of us. No matter how many books I write, every time I get to the end I think, this is just a pile of rubbish. You never know when you're writing it if it's really something worth publishing or not, but you just have to stick with it and believe in yourself. So I think that every one of us here today has had that experience of sitting there with a pile of manuscript thinking, I'll never get anywhere with this. But there are 4 people here today to prove that you can make it. So tell us, you guys, what's next?
In terms of 7 Lies, there is a TV option, and a screenwriter started work just at the beginning of lockdown, so I'm keeping my fingers really, really firmly crossed for that. And in terms of me and writing, I was about to say that I'm working on book 2, but that would be a slight misrepresentation. I have started working on quite a few book 2s. I think I've probably written maybe 150,000 words since I finished Seven Lies, trying to find something that feels as exciting to me as Seven Lies did when I first started that. And I'm tempted not to say this, but I started a few weeks ago something new again, and for the first time I think I might have that feeling. It is another dark, quite sinister book. It looks at women again and how women interact with other women, but this time it's focusing on sisters. So I'm crossing my fingers that this might be the one. The challenge for me this time is I had a baby at the very beginning of the year, so time is even more complicated than before with a 4-month-old around the house. But I'm confident that I will find the hours, and slowly but surely the book will get done.
What's next for me is a bit of a surprise. Ultimately, when I wrote this book, I was convinced I was writing a standalone book. I wanted to ground it very much in reality. I didn't want it to become like Midsummer. I don't want my homeless guy tripping over bodies for the next 20 years. It would kind of ruin the authenticity that I'm aiming for, really. But all of the people who were interested thought it was a series, and ultimately convinced me that there was some strength in continuing. So I'm now looking at a trilogy at the least, and book 2, One Way Street, is now written. There's a slight delay. The paperback for The Man on the Street is out in September. And then the ebook of One Way Street, book 2, the sequel to The Man on the Street, is out at the end of October. So it's another one of those where slow, and then everything happens at once. So I've got a paperback in September of book 1, and One Way Street is out in book 2. And I'm currently just starting book 3, which I'm calling Dead End Street, but publishers tend to change titles. I'm hoping this one will keep, because we've got a bit of a street theme going on in the titles now, and I think it's the obvious next step. And I've started the first chapter in a cemetery, so that should clinch Dead End Street for me. So look out for One Way Street and Dead End Street coming to an e-book shop and a proper bookshop in the very near future.
At the moment, I'm doing a PhD in creative critical writing, and as part of the PhD, I'm writing a novel. It's very different from Gin Petrol and the Purple Line, but it's really, too early to say anything about it. I don't know how it's going to pan out, so we'll see.
More books. My little idea of how I see myself is as this sort of feminist hermit crab. I like going into different genres and trying to figure out how I can explode them from the inside. What I will always want to write are books with a good story. A good story is very important to me, with a kind of little subversive feminist element to them that makes them maybe a little bit different from other things that are out there. That's all I want to do.
And just in case your appetite hasn't been whetted enough, our 4 authors are all going to read a little bit from their books to give you a flavour of what they've written. And frankly, I don't see how you can resist that.
So this is as Jane is about to tell her very first lie. She has just had dinner with Marnie and with Marnie's boyfriend Charles. "Things are going well with Charles," she said. A prickle climbed my spine, pulling me straight, forcing air into my lungs. We had only talked about their relationship once before then, and it had been a conversation fraught with a long, twisted history of a very old friendship. Ever since, we had spoken only in practical terms. Their plans for the weekend, the house they might someday buy far beyond the outer limits of London. His mother, riddled with cancer, living in Scotland and dying a very slow, painful, lonely death. We had not, for example, discussed the fact that they had been together for 3 years, and that several months earlier I had found unexpectedly, and I know I shouldn't have been looking, a diamond engagement ring hidden in the depths of Charles's bedside table. Nor had we discussed the fact that even without that ring, they were careering towards a permanent commitment that would bind them eternally, in a way that even after almost 20 years, Marnie and I had never been bound. We had not discussed the fact that I hated him. Yes, I replied, because I was afraid that a full sentence, perhaps even a 2-syllable word, would send our friendship hurtling into chaos. Don't you think, she said, don't you think that things are looking good for us? I nodded. You think we're right for each other, don't you? She asked. Jane? Yes, I replied. I do. That was the first lie I told Marnie. I wonder now most days, in fact, if I hadn't told that first lie, would I have told the others? I like to tell myself that the first lie was the least significant of them all, but that, ironically, is a lie. If I had been honest that Friday evening, everything might have been. It would have been different. I want you to know this now. I thought I was doing the right thing. Old friendships are like knotted rope, worn in some parts and thick and bulbous in others. I feared that this thread of our love was too thin, too frayed to bear the weight of my truth. Because surely the truth, that I had never hated anyone the way I hated him, would have destroyed our friendship. This, then, is the truth. I don't mean to sound so dramatic, but I think you deserve to know this story. I guess I think that you need to know this story. It is as much yours as it is mine. Charles is dead, yes, but that was never my intention.
I thought I'd take the advice of Julie Andrews for this and start at the very beginning. So I'm just going to read you a brief introduction. Page 1, chapter 1. Lees's Park, Newcastle, June the 1st, 2012. Jimmy didn't have a watch. He liked watches well enough, but these days they were more used as currency. The last time he'd found one, in a bin behind one of the big houses in Jesmond, he'd swapped it for some dog biscuits. It didn't matter, because he could always tell what time it was, or near enough as made no difference, like now. It was somewhere between 3 and 3:30 a.m. He used to be more precise, always within 10 minutes, one way or the other, he reckoned. But since they brought in the late licensing laws, the mixture of noise and light from the bars and clubs had messed with his head a bit, and he was sometimes out by an hour or more. It was easier here, though, quieter. Lees's Park wasn't his normal patch, but he liked to keep on the move. It was harder to hit a moving target. His favourite spot when he first came back to Newcastle 5 months ago now was just behind Greg's in the main street. The warmth generated by the ovens seemed to stick around all night. When you were hungry, though, the lingering smell of cheese pasties could drive you insane. On the plus side, you sometimes found a few in the bins, past their sell-by date, but good enough for the likes of him and Dog. Then some bastard put spikes in the ground to stop people crashing there.
So I'm going to read a short extract from my novel. It's about a third of a way into the novel, but it's from a mythological story. The book features about 3 stories about spirits and ghosts, which the people in this neighborhood believe in. This is a time, the children are disappearing. They're not getting any help from the government or the police. So it's to these stories about ghosts and spirits that they turn to for comfort and solace. And this particular story is about the jinns in the book's title. It's based on a real ruin in Delhi, where jinns are meant to live, and people go there to pray to these jinns. So it's inspired by that real place. We believe jinns moved into this palace around the time our last kings died, their hearts broken by the crooked victories of white men who claim to be our rulers. No one knows where the jinns came from, if Allah Ta'ala sent them, or if they were summoned here by the feverish utterances of the devout. They've been here for so long, they must have watched the walls of this palace crumble, the pillars soften with moss and creepers, and pythons slither over cracked stones like dreams wavering in the light of dawn. Every year, they must feel the wind trembling the chamba trees in the garden, sharing flowers as fragrant as vials of attar. We can't see jinns unless they take the form of a black dog or a cat or a snake, but we feel their presence the moment we step into these palace grounds, in the rustle that tickles the backs of our necks like the branch of a shrub, in the breeze blowing our shirts, and in the lightness we feel in our hearts as we pray. We can see you're frightened, but listen, listen. We've been caretakers of this jinn palace for years, and we can assure you they've never harmed anyone. Yes, there are bad jinns and trickster jinns and infidel jinns who want to possess your soul, but the ones who live here, the jinns who read the letters that believers have written to them, they're the good jinns Allah Ta'ala shaped out of smokeless fire to serve us. They're saints. Look now at the crowd thronging these grounds, flinging cubes of meat up into the sky for kites to catch, leaving foil bowls of milk for dogs, on the odd chance that one of the kites or the dogs is a jinn in another form. These believers are from all faiths. It's not just us Muslims. Here there are Sikhs and Hindus and Christians and maybe even Buddhists. They come here clutching the letters they've written to the jinns, and they will paste their petitions on the Padri walls. At night, when the gates are locked and the ash tips of joss sticks collapse to the ground, the jinns will read the letters, scented with incense and flowers. They read fast, not like us. If they find your wish genuine, they will grant your request.
Death. Seen him. Loads of times. Death's just a bloke. Average height, brownish hair. Couldn't tell you what colour his eyes are, but I can tell you he's nothing special to look at. He doesn't look angry or sad or evil, just a bit bored. But at the end of the day, he's a guy with a job to do. So what he does is he comes up to you and he opens your mouth and he just pulls the life out of you. Tell you what it's like. It's like a dentist pulling out a tooth. Imagine that. Then he turns around and he shrugs like he's saying, I don't make the rules. And he takes his little machine he carries and he logs the life into his system. And then he walks off to the next job. And that's that. He's been hanging about. He's been trying to look through the windows, leaving gates open, messing with cameras. Left a note. I found you, but then I found it. Didn't give it to anyone. Lay on it like a grenade. Bang.
Wow, that's a hard act to follow. And you're going to have to follow it. And I want you to follow the track all the way down to the bookshop to get these 4 books and dive in at the deep end and enjoy them as much as I have enjoyed them. Thanks for joining us today. You've been listening to the New Blood panel at the 2020 Theakston's Old Peculiar Harrogate Crime Writing Festival. Good to see you.
Okay, Val, that's a wrap.
Great, I can go and drink this now. It's funny, nobody's ever noticed that a bottle of Theakston's Old Peculiar is just like a crime novel.
Thanks for joining us. If you have enjoyed this event as part of the Harrogate International Festivals, please do think about a donation to ensure that our festivals can survive in the future. Donations can be made by texting HIF and the amount to 70085. For more events, please visit our online hub, the HIF Player. It's packed with upcoming live streams, events you've missed, archive recordings, and much more.
Looking for your next gripping page-turner? Head over to Dead Good, the home of killer crime books, TV and film, for recommendations, discounted books at bargain prices and exclusive giveaways. Visit deadgoodbooks.co.uk, sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. See you in Harrogate for the Dead Good Reader Awards in 2021. We can't wait.